Darkness still clung to the narrow spit of land east of Alexandria when the first tremors of battle stirred the pre-dawn air. It was Sao, 21, March 1801, and the winds rolling in from the Mediterranean carried a faint haze of sea mist that mingled with the lingering scent of gunpowder from skirmishes the day before. Along the sandy ridge, British soldiers lay in line beneath the fading stars, their muskets beside them, their boots filled with grit from the shifting dunes. To their right, the surf whispered against the shore. To their left, the shallow lagoons and salt pools reflected the ghostly silhouettes of entrenchments and the broken remains of ancient Roman ruins, the shattered bones of the city of Nicopolis. It was a battlefield unlike any other of the age, half desert, half seascape, and wholly unforgiving. Within these uneasy ranks stood the men of the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, the Black Watch. Their dark feathered bonnets were barely visible in the gloom, but their presence anchored a part of the British line that would soon be tested beyond endurance. They had already distinguished themselves in the amphibious landing at Aboukir Bay earlier in the month, storming the dunes with their bayonets fixed and their discipline intact. Now they stood silent once more, waiting for Napoleon's veterans to strike. Across the dark no-man's land, the French army of Egypt, battle-hardened troops who had followed the tricolour from Italy to Syria and back, moved in disciplined columns. Over 10,000 French troops, supported by 46 guns, advanced under the command of General Jacques-François Menou, a man whose leadership would soon be tested under the most unforgiving conditions. The French had every reason to attack swiftly. British forces, numbering between 10,000 and 14,000 men under Lieutenant General Sir Ralph Abercrombie, had carved a foothold east of Alexandria and threatened to expel the French from Egypt entirely. The British position stretched along the sandhills, with the sea at their right and the inland lakes to their left. General John Moore, commanding the right wing, held the exposed flank where the dunes rose and fell in soft waves. Behind the thin picket lines, Moore's division waited in uneasy stillness. The Guards Brigade, the 28th Foot, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the 40th Foot, and the Black Watch, each unit arranged with precision, though the ground beneath them shifted with every breath of wind. Further down the line stood a redoubt, manned not by infantry, but by Royal Navy sailors and Marines, who had dragged a heavy naval gun ashore. Nearby, gunboats patrolled close to the coastline, their cannons ready to enfilade any French attack attempting to turn the British left. This mixture of infantry, artillery, and naval firepower created a formidable but fragile defensive position on the sandy ridge. As the final minutes of darkness faded, a profound stillness enveloped the field. Then, sometime around 3:30 a.m., the sharp crack of musketry tore through the night. French skirmishers had driven in the British outposts. Moments later, the deeper rumble of feet in the sand announced the approach of France's assault columns. The ground itself seemed to pulse as thousands of boots pressed forward under the command of Generals Lannoux, Silly, and Rampon, each determined to smash the British line before daylight revealed the full layout of the defensive works. The British soldiers rose to their feet. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with anticipation. From Moore's right flank, men could hear the distant shouting of French officers urging their battalions onward. Bayonets glinted faintly against the approaching dawn, and the first flickers of musket fire illuminated French uniforms emerging from the haze. The opening shock fell hardest on the British right. Lannous's brigade struck the 28th Foot, unleashing a torrent of musketry so close that flashes from the muzzles lit the sand like lightning strikes. French infantry, moving in their typical attack columns, slammed into the British line, attempting to break through with sheer weight and momentum. The British, fighting in the thin red line too deep, replied with volleys delivered at murderous effect. But the French did not break easily. They surged again, driving towards the Roman ruins where visibility was still little more than an arm's length. The air filled with shouts, musket smoke, and the metallic clang of ramrods and bayonets. The battlefield was becoming a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes, friend and foe, often no more than silhouettes in the swirling haze. And into this growing chaos, the Black Watch would soon be drawn. The grey light of dawn slowly unveiled the battlefield as the French assault gathered momentum. What began as scattered musket shots along the picket line now surged into a coordinated and violent onslaught. General François Lannes, commanding some of the most experienced French infantry in Egypt, drove his troops straight toward the British right, where Major General John Moore had positioned his division in a precarious but deliberate line along the sandhills. The British right flank, closest to the Mediterranean surf, was the most exposed, and therefore the most likely point for Manou's opening blow. The French emerged from the morning haze in dense attack columns, their formations designed to push with weight and cohesion through narrow points in the terrain. Skirmishers fanned out ahead of them, firing at anything that moved in the dim, smoky air. Behind them came waves of infantry, whose tricolour flags snapped faintly in the rising wind. These were veterans of the Revolutionary Wars, soldiers who had fought in Italy, in Syria, and across the Nile Delta. Their confidence was well earned, and their approach was swift. The British, by contrast, stood in thin, two-rank lines, seemingly fragile when compared to the mass of French columns. Yet this formation maximised firepower, and Moore's men had proved their discipline repeatedly in the days leading up to the battle. At Alexandria, that discipline was tested at once. The 28th North Gloucestershire Regiment of Foot, positioned near the centre right, bore the brunt of the initial impact. French troops crashed against them in the darkness, forcing the regiment to react instantly. As the French pressed in front, another French force manoeuvred behind the ridge and struck the regiment's rear. For a moment, the 28th found themselves surrounded, fighting two directions at once. The regiment calmly turned half its ranks to face the rear while keeping its front locked against Lannes's attack. It was this extraordinary display that later earned them the unique distinction of wearing numbers on both their front and back, the only British regiment ever to do so. As the light strengthened, the full extent of the French assault became visible. The ruins of ancient Nicopolis, columns, broken archways, and toppled stone blocks provided scant cover as French infantry forced their way through. The shattered walls turned the battle into a brutal contest at close quarters. Smoke drifted in thick waves among the ruins, catching the first rays of the sun and creating shifting curtains of light and shadow. Through these shadows, the distinctive silhouettes of Highland bonnets and British shakos appeared and disappeared as men clashed bayonet to bayonet in the confined spaces. On Moore's extreme right, nearer the shoreline, the Guards Brigade held firm under intense pressure. The Coldstream Guards and the 3rd Guards delivered disciplined volleys, slowing the French advance but unable to halt it entirely. Lannes's troops continued to push forward, and at times the French came so close that the Guards' line seemed ready to buckle. Yet the steady beat of British volleys, coordinated and unhurried, inflicted mounting casualties on the attackers. Further inland, the 40th Foot and the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers fought doggedly to keep the French from turning the centre. The air grew thick with the acrid reek of powder, and the sand vibrated under the concussive blasts of muskets and artillery. British field guns roared from hastily constructed earthworks, their gunners firing as fast as they could swab their barrels. The sound of each discharge echoed off the dunes and ruins, adding to the thunderous chaos echoing across the battlefield. But despite the British resistance, the French continued to advance. Lannes's column, still driving forward with relentless momentum, penetrated deeper toward the British right centre. He aimed to split Moore's line, isolate the flank, and roll the British position toward the sea. The early hours of the battle were thus a test of endurance. French determination measured against British discipline. As the fighting intensified, British officers scanned the lines for signs of wavering. They saw instead a wall of smoke and muzzle flashes, the silhouettes of their men holding steady under extraordinary pressure. Yet behind the dunes, another threat was forming. A threat that would soon burst upon the reserve and test the resolve of the Black Watch. As the fighting surged along the British right, the 142nd Royal Highland Regiment, the Black Watch, waited in the reserve position behind Moore's embattled troops. Though removed from the initial shock of the French assault, they could hear the fierce crescendo of musketry and shouts drifting across the sand. The light of dawn now crept higher over the Mediterranean, casting a pale glow across the dunes and revealing swirling smoke that clung low to the earth as if unwilling to disperse. Each ripple of gunfire illuminated the haze in twitching bursts of orange, and the Highlanders stood ready, their bayonets glimmering dully in the muted light. The Black Watch had earned a formidable reputation long before the Egyptian campaign. They were renowned for steadiness under fire and unyielding discipline when facing even the fiercest assaults. At Alexandria, those qualities would be tested in ways that even their seasoned veterans could scarcely have anticipated. Positioned behind the forward line, they observed the chaos unfolding around the ruins of Nicopolis, where the house, 28th foot, struggled against attacks from both front and rear, and where guards and fusiliers answered wave after wave of musketry. But soon, the reserve itself would be forced into the heart of the storm. As the French pushed through the darkness, one of Lannous's columns managed to exploit a gap between the British forward units. A portion of the attackers surged toward the rear positions, moving fast across the uneven sand. In the confusion of smoke and shadows, French infantry stumbled directly into the area held by the 42nd. They came onto the Highlanders almost suddenly, their bayonets lowered, their uniforms spattered with sand and powder residue from the fight through the ruins. The first clash was brutal. The proximity of the opposing forces made firing a musket volley all but impossible. Instead, the confrontation became an immediate struggle of strength and resolve, of men grappling, thrusting, and driving with bayonets amid swirling dust and choking smoke. French infantry attempting to force their way into the British rear found themselves instead colliding with the disciplined ranks of the Black Watch. The Highlanders countered with swift, controlled movements, their bayonets finding their marks in the chaos. Amid this melee, the Highlanders overwhelmed the French detachment and, in the fierce struggle, seized a French colour from the attackers. This trophy belonged to elements later remembered as part of the so-called Invincibles, a proud unit whose capture symbolised a dramatic reversal of French aggression. The colour did not long remain securely within British hands. Confusion saw it lost again when a wounded sergeant collapsed in the tumult. But its temporary capture became one of the enduring legends of the regiment's conduct that day, a testament to their ferocity and steadiness in the worst of conditions. The ground around the 42nd became a tortured landscape of churned sand, splintered equipment, and fallen men. Through the muskets' thick haze, officers and sergeants moved along the line, ensuring that the Highlanders maintained cohesion amid the violence. The soundscape was deafening. The sharp crack of close musket discharges, the deep concussion of artillery firing from the redoubts, and the occasional distant boom of naval guns offshore. Against this backdrop, the Highlanders stood unbroken. Yet this was only the beginning. Even as the Black Watch expelled the French infantry that had penetrated the line, another threat approached with ominous clarity. The ground beneath their boots seemed to shudder as a new force advanced, the rhythmic pounding of hooves belonging to General Royce's cavalry. Despite reservations from their commander, the French cavalry had been ordered into an aggressive charge by Menou, who believed that a decisive blow could crush the British rear. The Highlanders sensed the danger as the silhouettes of French dragoons and chasseurs materialized through the haze. The cavalry charge was not a disciplined, coordinated strike, but a desperate thrust ordered under poor judgment. Still, it carried deadly potential. The Black Watch braced themselves, adjusting their formation to present a wall of bayonets capable of repelling mounted assault. They had no time for elaborate square formations on the shifting sand, but they created dense, bristling ranks that served the same purpose. Muskets lowered, bayonets angled upward, the regiment prepared for the full force of the coming impact. The French cavalry hit with a roar. Horses reared and screamed as they encountered the impenetrable forest of Highland steel. Dragoons cut downward with sabres, but their blows glanced off the compact formation. Remarkably, of all the Highlanders engaged, only the 13 men suffered sabre wounds, a testament not only to their discipline, but to the controlled collective cohesion that defined the regiment. Instead of breaking, the Highland line held firm, absorbing the charge and turning it away with lethal efficiency. The failed cavalry attack left the sand strewn with riderless horses and wounded troopers, and the French survivors attempted to fall back. The Black Watch remained steady, their line battered but unbroken, having withstood both infantry and cavalry assaults within minutes. They had become a bulwark, a living anchor in the centre-right of the British defences. Yet the battle still raged along the broader line. Dawn had fully seized the sky, revealing the true expanse of the battlefield. Smoke drifted over the dunes in slow waves as French forces continued to press in other sectors. The Black Watch had held, but the day would demand even more from Moore's division, from the Guards, and from Abercrombie's entire army. And as the fight intensified, the most consequential moments of the battle were still unfolding. As the sun rose higher above the Mediterranean, the battlefield of Alexandria transformed into a violent tableau of smoke, fire, and shifting formations. The early morning haze, thickened by gunpowder and drifting sand, veiled the combatants in a ghostly half-light. While the Black Watch held firm against infantry and cavalry on the right, the centre of the British line now bore the brunt of new French assaults. These attacks, led by General Antoine Rampont, were intended to exploit the chaos along Moore's division and drive directly at the heart of Abercrombie's defences. The French columns advanced with characteristic determination, their ranks packed tightly as they pushed forward through the undulating dunes. Though they had suffered setbacks near the ruins of Nicopolis, their momentum had not faltered. Rampont's troops moved with the confidence of veterans, flags rippling behind them as they pressed toward the British centre, shouting commands drowned by the thunder of artillery. Their objective was clear: split the British line, crush the central brigades, and unravel the defensive position piece by piece. Standing in their path were the steady battalions of the Guards Brigade, elements of Oncout's command, and the unyielding formations of the Royal Welch Fusiliers, the 40th Foot Ore, and other infantry regiments positioned across the sandhills. These troops had been fighting since dawn, firing volley after volley into advancing French ranks. The air was so saturated with smoke that officers often recognized friend from foe only by the cadence of their fire. Still, the British line held in its characteristic thin formation, maximizing firepower and maintaining cohesion even as casualties mounted. It was here, in the centre, that British artillery played a decisive role. Field batteries, positioned behind slight rises in the sand, fired continuously, round shot and canister ripping into the tightly packed French columns. Each discharge sent a deep concussion through the dunes, the recoil kicking up sprays of sand. The gunners worked with practiced urgency, ramming home charges with sweat-soaked hands, their faces streaked with powder. Smoke enveloped them completely, but the rhythm of their fire never faltered. And then there was the thunder from the sea. To the British left, where the shoreline curved inward toward Alexandria, lay one of the most unusual and significant elements of the battlefield. A heavy naval gun, landed ashore and emplaced in a stout redoubt. This was manned not by infantry, but by Royal Navy sailors and Marines, who had dragged the massive piece across the sand and fortified its position with earth and timber. Out at sea, gunboats prowled near the coast, their shallow hulls allowing them to approach within devastating range of the French flank. As Rampont's columns pressed toward the British line, these naval guns opened fire. The impact was immediate and severe. Naval cannonballs, heavier and fired at deadly enfilading angles, tore into the side of the French formations, sweeping entire files of men from the columns. Sailors worked the guns with the methodical ferocity of men accustomed to shipboard combat. Each broadside crash reverberated across the water, echoing against the dunes and amplifying the terror among the French infantry. French commanders, already frustrated by Lanous's heavy losses on the right, now faced an unexpected torrent of fire that threatened to disintegrate their central assault. Menou himself, observing from behind his lines, could see the growing disarray in Rampont's columns. Despite the determination of the French troops, the relentless crossfire of musketry, artillery, and naval guns was hacking away at their strength. The infantry tried to close the distance, but every gain was met with withering volleys from British lines that remained astonishingly intact under pressure. Compounding the French difficulties was the nature of the terrain. The narrow spit of land restricted their ability to deploy broadly or maneuver easily. The dunes were uneven, the sand loose, and the ruins of Nicopolis created choke points that bottlenecked advancing troops. Men who attempted to push through the crumbling stone blocks or climb shattered walls found themselves exposed on all sides to British fire. Meanwhile, British positions, though far from ideal, had been chosen with care, forming a defensive spine that anchored itself between the sea and the lagoon. As the centre battle intensified, reinforcements moved between sectors. The guards, their uniforms coated in smoke and powder, advanced and fell back in measured steps, adjusting their lines to meet each new assault. Coote's men delivered relentless volleys, the double crash of muskets pulsing like a heartbeat across the ridge. The 40th and the Fusiliers countered French thrusts with controlled, deliberate bayonet charges that sent Rampon's troops reeling. All the while, the Black Watch remained a crucial anchor on the right, absorbing cavalry attacks and helping to stabilize the entire line. Their steadfast defense ensured that British forces could shift reserves toward the center without risking a catastrophic breakthrough. The synergy of infantry discipline, artillery coordination, and naval firepower began to shift the momentum decisively. By mid-morning, the French central attack had begun to falter. Casualties mounted, cohesion weakened, and even veteran troops struggled to maintain their formations under the combined pressure. The thunder of naval guns continued to pound their exposed flank, and the sandhills that had seemed so conquerable before dawn now served as a barrier they could not breach. But the battle was far from over. Though Rampon's columns were stalled and Lannous's earlier attacks had been repulsed, General Menou still held one more reserve force, his cavalry. He would order them into action next, committing them to an assault that would send them crashing once more toward the British right, toward the Highlanders, and toward the heart of the British position, where Abercrombie himself stood near the line. As the battle reached its crescendo, the air over the battlefield had grown so thick with gunpowder smoke that at times the sun appeared as a muted disk, filtered through a shifting veil of grey. The sandhills trembled beneath the continuous thunder of artillery, and the cries of wounded men and horses mingled with the crashing surf only a few hundred yards away. The French assaults on the right and centre had met with fierce British resistance. Yet, General Menou believed the moment had come to deliver a decisive stroke. If his infantry could not break the British line, perhaps a powerful cavalry charge could. Against the better judgment of his subordinates, he prepared to unleash his mounted reserve. The man tasked with this dangerous duty was Massam. General Ruiz, commander of the French cavalry. His troopers consisted of seasoned Highland dragoons and chasseurs, men who had served across the Mediterranean campaigns and who understood all too well the risks of charging well-prepared infantry. Ruiz protested Menou's order, for he knew that the narrow dunes, soft sand, and entrenched positions made such an attack perilous. But Menou, gesturing with urgency, insisted upon it. The cavalry were to strike the British rear, disrupt their command structure, and create enough chaos to open a gap for renewed infantry assault. The French horsemen gathered behind the dunes, their numbers difficult to discern through the haze. Their sabres glinted faintly in the dim light filtering through drifting smoke. The ground vibrated with the collective rhythm of hooves stamping in anticipation. As the order was given, the mass of cavalry began to move, picking up speed as they crested the ridges and surged toward the British lines near the centre right, directly toward the zone held by reserves, staff, and elements of the foul 42nd Highlanders, who had only moments earlier repelled the French infantry thrust. The thunder of hooves rolled across the battlefield, and figures emerged through the smoke like apparitions, horsemen lowering their sabres for the final approach. The British infantry had seconds to adjust. Many regiments in this sector had already endured intense combat, and the shifting sands made it difficult to form a textbook square. Nonetheless, British discipline prevailed. Soldiers contracted their ranks, presenting dense formations of bayonets angled outward. The Highlanders, still recovering from the earlier melee, tightened their lines instinctively, creating a bristling barrier of steel. The French cavalry struck with explosive force, Horses reared and screamed as they collided with the angled bayonets, some tumbling forward in violent spasms as their momentum carried them into the wall of pikes and muskets. Dragoons slashed downward with sabres, but the blows rarely found their mark. The Highlanders fought with disciplined precision, their bayonets driving upward to unhorse attackers or deflecting sabre strokes with the butt end of muskets. The roar of the collision was immense, a rolling shockwave of sound that echoed across the dunes. But the cavalry charge was not merely aimed at breaking the infantry. Its deeper objective was to disrupt the British command structure, and at that moment, Lieutenant General Sir Ralph Abercrombie was dangerously close to the fighting. Positioned forward to oversee the battle, Abercrombie insisted on witnessing the action directly, refusing to command from a distant vantage point. This put him in harm's way as Royce's cavalry crashed into the rear areas of the British line. Amid the swirling smoke and chaos, a group of French dragoons penetrated the British rear, momentarily threatening the commander himself. Abercrombie fought to remain mounted as the cavalrymen advanced. Accounts describe the moment as one of immense confusion, dust, shouting, and the sudden tumult of hooves pounding dangerously close. In the chaos, the British general found himself nearly captured by the French horsemen. It was here, among the dunes and drifting sand, that a Highlander of the 42nd Regiment intervened. Charging into the fray, this soldier helped drive back the dragoons long enough for Abercrombie to be freed from their grasp. During the struggle, the general received a severe wound. A musket ball struck his thigh. Despite the seriousness of the injury, Abercrombie refused to leave the field while the battle still hung in balance. He continued directing his army, resolute, even as blood seeped through his uniform and soaked the saddle beneath him. Meanwhile, the cavalry attack was unraveling. The French horsemen had expected to find open ground and vulnerable infantry. Instead, they encountered concealed redoubts, jagged terrain, and relentless British musketry. As they attempted to regroup and retreat, the naval gun crew in the shoreline redoubt brought their heavy cannon to bear once more. Great iron shot tore into the cavalry's flank, sending horses tumbling and scattering survivors back toward their lines. By the time the remnants of Royce's cavalry withdrew, the assault had become a costly failure. The Black Watch and the surrounding British units had held firm, suffering remarkably few sabre wounds. Only 13 Highlanders had been cut in the melee, a testament to their unbroken formation. The French had gambled on a dramatic breakthrough, but instead they found themselves repelled with grievous losses. Yet despite this repulse, the battle was not finished. The French infantry, though battered, still clung to parts of the field, and Menou had not yet conceded defeat. The British line remained intact, but exhausted. Smoke drifted across the sand in slow, ominous waves as both armies braced for the next phase of the struggle. And though Abercrombie tried to remain at the front, his wound would soon force him into the care of his officers, a development that would have consequences for the remainder of the campaign. By mid-morning, the fury of the French assault had begun to ebb. What had begun hours earlier in darkness and swirling smoke had evolved into a sprawling tableau of exhaustion, shattered formations, and grim endurance. The battlefield was littered with the forms of men and horses, scattered equipment, and the churned sand where countless charges had broken and dissolved. The French attacks on the right, in the centre, and across the dunes, had failed to crack the British line. Yet Menou's troops, veterans of campaigns from Italy to Syria, continued to fight with tenacity, unwilling to concede the field. The British, for their part, had weathered attacks of extraordinary intensity. The Guards Brigade had braced itself through repeated clashes around the fragments of ancient Nicopolis. The 28th Foot, surrounded earlier and forced to fight front and rear, maintained their ground through sheer discipline. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the 40th Foot had delivered volleys that tore into French columns, attempting to exploit any weakness in the line, and the Black Watch, having repelled both infantry and cavalry assaults, remained a steadfast anchor on the right, ragged, smoke-streaked, but unbroken. But the French still had not fully withdrawn. Even after the catastrophic failure of the cavalry charge and the heavy losses inflicted by the naval guns, pockets of French resistance continued to press forward. The battlefield trembled with sporadic musket fire as surviving French infantry sought to reorganize for renewed attempts. Their commanders, including Generals Rainier et Silly and Rampont, attempted to stabilize their shattered formations. Menot himself gesticulated urgently from the rear, urging his men forward and attempting to restore order where the morning's assaults had faltered. Yet the tide of battle had turned decisively. The British maintained a disciplined rhythm of fire, their volleys delivered without haste or panic. Gunners swabbed out their cannons and fired again, sending canister and round shot into the remaining French positions. Naval gunfire from the shoreline redoubt continued to pound the enemy flank whenever movement was detected. The impact of each shot rolled like thunder across the dunes. The French attacks dwindled. Formations that had charged boldly before dawn now advanced hesitantly, each step forward meeting a storm of musketry. The columns wavered as their ranks thinned. Cohesion dissolved into scattered clusters of exhausted men, trying to find cover behind ridges and ruined walls. The weight of casualties bore heavily on morale. Men who had fought in some of Napoleon's most celebrated victories now found themselves stymied by British lines that refused to bend. By late morning, the French withdrawal began in earnest. It was not a single coordinated retreat, but a gradual unraveling of the assault. Units fell back toward Alexandria in ones and twos, then in larger bodies, drifting away from the line as officers realized that further attacks would only lead to needless slaughter. The momentum that had carried them across the sandhills before dawn had evaporated. The British, though triumphant, were in no condition to pursue aggressively. Their line had been stretched thin, and the losses, while lighter than the French, were significant. More than 1,200 wounded, and Yumei, over 240 killed, lay across the dunes or were carried toward makeshift medical tents. Among the wounded was Abercrombie, whose condition worsened as the hours passed. The musket ball lodged deep in his thigh caused internal damage that no field surgeon could effectively treat. Nonetheless, he refused to relinquish command until he was physically removed from the field. By 10 a.m., the battle had largely subsided. A tense quiet settled over the sandhills, broken only by the groans of the wounded, the distant rumble of retreating French formations, and the weary movements of British soldiers reloading, repositioning, or aiding comrades. From the vantage points along the ridge, officers surveyed the scene. French forces drifting back toward Alexandria, their columns ragged, their flags drooping, their artillery limping behind on damaged carriages. The once confident army of Egypt was now in retreat. The terrain itself bore silent witness to the struggle. The loose sands were carved into deep grooves by cavalry charges, their surfaces scorched by musket blasts and cannon fire. The ruins of Nicopolis, already weathered by centuries, had been reduced further by the impact of round shot and by hand-to-hand combat among their stones. Everywhere lay the imprint of desperate struggle. Scattered muskets, broken bayonets, shattered timbers, and the remnants of French equipment dragged and crushed in the chaos. Despite their exhaustion, British soldiers took stock of what they had accomplished. They had stood firm against some of the finest veterans of revolutionary France. They had repelled attacks through the pre-dawn gloom, beaten back infantry columns, turned away cavalry charges, and held their line under conditions that might have broken less disciplined troops. The synergy of infantry firepower, well-positioned artillery, and effective naval support had created a defensive position of remarkable resilience, and within that victory, individual moments of heroism shone brightly. The 28th Foot's steady stand under attack from both front and rear. The disciplined volleys of the guards, the calm determination of the artillery crews who fired through smoke so thick they could barely see their targets, and the ferocity of the Black Watch, whose resistance at crucial moments kept the right wing from collapsing. As the French retreat accelerated, British officers confirmed the outcome. The field belonged to Abercrombie's army. The French had failed to break the line at Alexandria, and the path to pushing them out of Egypt entirely now lay open. But even in triumph, British troops felt the weight of the morning's combat, the losses, the exhaustion, and the knowledge that their commander's wound might yet prove fatal. For now, though, the battle had ended. The day belonged to the British, and the legend of the Highlanders at Alexandria, their discipline, their bayonets locked against both cavalry and infantry, and their brief capture of the French colour, was already beginning to take shape among those who had witnessed the fight. When the smoke finally began to lift from the sandhills east of Alexandria, the full weight of the battle's toll emerged. The cries of the wounded echoed through the broken ruins of Nicopolis, carried on the breeze that came rolling in from the Mediterranean. The surf beat steadily upon the shore, indifferent to the carnage that now lay scattered across the dunes. British soldiers moved slowly among the fallen, lifting comrades onto stretchers, retrieving muskets, and gathering what equipment could still be salvaged. The French retreat had become unmistakable. Menou's army, battered and disordered, was withdrawing toward the city in the far distance, its formations dissolving into the shimmering haze of late morning. Though victorious, the British paid dearly for their stand. The official casualty lists would later record 243 killed, 1,253 wounded, and 32 missing. Among the wounded was the commander himself, Lieutenant General Sir Ralph Abercrombie, carried from the field after refusing for hours to abandon his post. His wound, a musket ball deeply embedded in his thigh, was grievous. Though he had continued issuing orders until the final French withdrawal, the damage was irreversible. Within a week, aboard HMS Foudroyant, Abercrombie succumbed to his injuries on Montmorin, 28th of March, 1801. His death cast a somber shadow across the victory. Soldiers who had watched him ride along the line at dawn now learned that the cost of their triumph included the life of the general who had led them to it. The French losses were even heavier. Reports varied widely, but estimates ranged from 1,700 to 5,000 casualties, a reflection of the sheer intensity of the morning's fighting. Many French bodies lay among the dunes, sprawled where the volleys of the guards and the fusiliers had struck them down. Others lay near the ruins where the 28th had fought back-to-back, or where the Black Watch had surged forward in bursts of brutal close combat. Near the shoreline, the impact of naval gunfire was evident in mangled artillery pieces and shattered ranks of infantry caught in the sweeping arcs of iron shot fired from the ships and the heavy naval gun emplaced in the redoubt. Soldiers who had survived the battle spoke of the battlefield's strange contradictions: the beauty of the Mediterranean light glinting upon the sand, the eerie quiet that followed the violence, and the mingled reek of salt air, blood, and burned powder. Scattered around the dunes lay the cultural detritus of two armies: British canteens and torn haversacks, French shakoes, broken muskets of varied calibers, and the shattered remnants of tricolour banners. Here and there, Highland bonnets rested on the ground beside fallen men of the 42nd, their dark feathers limp beneath layers of dust. The Black Watch, though battered, emerged from the field with their reputation burnished even further. Their steadiness during the infantry penetration, their disciplined formation under the French cavalry assault, and the brief but symbolic capture of the French colour contributed to a legend that seemed to grow by the hour. Around campfires in the days that followed, soldiers recounted the moment when a handful of French troops, including men from the so-called Invincibles, had charged directly into the Highland lines, only to be repelled and disarmed. The French colour, seized amid the chaos, even if lost again in the crush of bodies, became a symbol of the regiment's ferocity and discipline. It was not a return to the wild Highland charges of past centuries, those dramatic rushes of claymore and targe seen in tales of the mid-18th century. The men of the 42nd were now professional soldiers of the British Army, drilled to fight with muskets, socket bayonets, and controlled volleys. Yet at Alexandria, for a few intense moments among collapsing walls and swirling smoke, witnesses felt that the spiriters of the Highland charge had returned. When the French broke through the smoke-filled shadows of the ruins, the Highlanders countered not with panicked fire, but with short, decisive surges, controlled bursts of violence that resembled, in spirit if not in form, the fierce charges of their ancestors. Where discipline met instinct, the Black Watch forged an aura that would shape their legacy for generations. Elsewhere, the 98th Foot found themselves the subject of admiration throughout the army. Their infamous moment, assaulted from front and rear simultaneously, became the stuff of military legend. Officers wrote in their journals about the regiment's composure, the split-second adjustment that enabled half the ranks to turn and deliver volleys at the rear enemy, while the rest held firm against the frontal attack. This feat earned the regiment the unprecedented right to wear the number 28 on the back of their headgear, marking a moment of survival and defiance under near impossible circumstances. The Guards, too, gained distinction for their role in the early dawn fighting, delivering steadfast volleys that tore apart French columns struggling through the dimly lit ruins. The Fusiliers and the 40th Foot contributed significantly to holding the line against Rampon's determined troops, while the naval detachments demonstrated the versatile power of seaborne fire support. The sailors and marines who manned the heavy gun on shore understood that their enfilading fire had been instrumental in preventing French breakthroughs along the centre, and British soldiers openly recognized the pivotal role of these naval reinforcements. In the broader strategic context, the Battle of Alexandria decisively shifted momentum in the Egyptian campaign. With their defeat on the sandhills, the French lost their final opportunity to push the British back into the sea. In the months that followed, August and September 1801, British forces advanced on Alexandria, eventually compelling its surrender and bringing an end to Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. What had begun with the landing at Abu Qir and culminated in the dawn battle on 21st March had now achieved its aim, the expulsion of French power from Egypt. Yet for all its strategic importance, the battle is remembered most vividly for its human scenes. The fighting among the ruins, the clash of lines at dawn, the thunder of naval guns echoing across the water, and the unyielding Highlanders whose actions cemented their legend. These images endured far longer than the campaign itself, carried home in letters, memoirs, and regimental histories. On that narrow spit of sand, between the sea and the lagoon, the British Army had faced one of Revolutionary France's most seasoned forces, and prevailed. In the weeks and months that followed the hard-fought victory at Alexandria, the significance of that dawn battle began to crystallize across both military and political landscapes. What had unfolded on 21st March 1801 was more than an isolated clash between two determined forces on a narrow strip of Egyptian sand. It was an engagement that marked the final turning point in the British campaign to expel French power from Egypt. It also became one of the defining moments in the storied history of the British Army, and especially in the legacy of the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, the Black Watch. The strategic consequences were immediate. With their defeat at Alexandria, General Menot's French Army of Egypt lost the initiative entirely. The momentum that had carried Republican France across Italy, the Nile, and the Levant had drained away in the face of British discipline, naval firepower, and tactical resilience. Over the summer of 1801, British forces under Ox John Hely Hutchinson, who assumed command after Abercrombie's death, pressed their advantage. One by one, French strongpoints fell back toward Alexandria, culminating in the city's surrender later that year. By September, the last remnants of Napoleon's foothold in Egypt capitulated, bringing an end to a campaign that had begun with such grand ambitions in 1798. Yet the tactical and operational importance of the battle was only part of its legacy. The memory of Alexandria became deeply tied to the men who had fought there, soldiers from across Britain whose actions resonated in regimental histories and national memory. The battlefield's vivid imagery lingered in the mind. The pre-dawn assault, the ruins of Nicopolis flickering with musket fire, the clash of bayonets on shifting sand, and the thunderous involvement of the Royal Navy's guns. Each of these scenes fed into a narrative of resilience and unity among British forces, a moment when infantry, artillery, and naval power blended to create a defensive line that could not be broken. Above all, the legend of the Black Watch emerged with striking clarity. Historians, soldiers, and artists alike returned to their role at Alexandria as evidence of the regiment's unshakable discipline. Though technically line infantry by this period, the Highlanders carried an aura that set them apart, one rooted in decades of service from the 7 Years' War to the American Revolution and beyond. The events at Alexandria reinforce this identity. Their disciplined stand against infantry and cavalry alike, their brief capture of a French colour in the chaos of the ruins, and their ability to hold formation under the weight of a powerful cavalry charge all solidified the regiment's reputation as one of the most steadfast and formidable in the British Army. The battle also revived, in symbolic form, the idea of the Highland Charge. Long romanticised in British military myth, the Highland Charge had come to represent the fierce courage and instinctive aggression of the Highland regiments. Though by 1801 the men of the 42nd fought as disciplined line infantry, using controlled volleys and bayonets rather than claymores and targes, observers at Alexandria felt that something of that old spirit reappeared in their short, brutal counter-assaults among the ruins. These actions, sharp, decisive, and delivered with a burst of ferocity, blended instinct and discipline in a way that left a lasting impression. In the decades that followed, artists depicted these moments with dramatic intensity, often showing Highlanders surging through smoke and sand, as if the ancestral charge had returned once more on the shores of Egypt. The 28th Footed too secured a lasting place in military memory. Their extraordinary moment of fighting front and rear simultaneously became the kind of regimental legend that officers recounted to new recruits for generations. The rare distinction granted to them, the wearing of a number on the back of their headgear, stands as a unique reminder of their steadfast conduct at Alexandria. In a time when armies typically remembered grand heroes or victorious generals, the survival of an entire regiment under such pressure gained a memorial of its own, etched not in stone, but in the uniform itself. Even the participation of the Royal Navy, often overshadowed in land battles, became a key part of how Alexandria was remembered. The naval gun crews who had dragged heavy cannon into shore batteries and the gunboats that prowled the coastline had proved instrumental. Their enfilading fire shredded French columns attempting to envelop the British left, and their steady bombardment provided a constant hammering force that French commanders simply could not counter. The blend of naval and land warfare at Alexandria gave the battle a distinctive character, often cited in later military analyses as a model of joint operations. Abercrombie's death added a somber note to the victory. Though he did not live to witness the campaign's final triumph, his conduct before and during the battle left a profound impression on his officers and men. His refusal to abandon the field after being wounded, his calm oversight of the line at dawn, and his unwavering belief in the discipline of his troops became foundational elements of the battle's narrative. Within Britain, he came to be remembered as a general whose life ended at the height of duty, a figure whose personal sacrifice embodied the cost of victory. As for the French, the defeat at Alexandria and the subsequent surrender of the army of Egypt marked the end of one of the most ambitious campaigns of the revolutionary era. The troops who had marched with Napoleon through the Nile Delta and into Syria now faced captivity or repatriation. The remnants of their once proud formations carried home stories not of conquest, but of the relentless British line that had stood firm on the sands of Egypt. The battlefield itself returned to silence. The broken fragments of Nicopolis remained scattered across the ridge. The sand smoothed over footprints, bloodstains, and the tracks of artillery. Over time, the Mediterranean winds reclaimed the ground where thousands had struggled for control of Egypt's destiny. But the memory of that morning endured, in regimental colours, in paintings, in memoirs, and in the national identity of Britain's army. For the Black Watch, Alexandria became another jewel in a long chain of battle honours. It reinforced a legacy defined by unwavering discipline, fierce close combat, and the ability to hold firm even when the weight of the enemy threatened to break the line. In the story of the British Empire's military past, the Highlanders' actions at Alexandria stood as a testament to endurance and to the resolve of soldiers who fought with both modern skill and ancestral spirit. And so, on that narrow spit of land between the sea and the lake, dawn on 21st March 1801 became more than a moment in a campaign. It became a legend, one in which the Black Watch played a leading role, where disciplined volleys and bristling bayonets shaped the outcome, and where the echoes of the Highland Charge seemed, for a brief moment, to return across the sands of Egypt. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.